Okay, good morning, guys. So, in the class we had yesterday, we were introduced into CSS. So, for today's class, we'll continue with introduction to CSS, but now we are not going to focus on, what we learned yesterday. So, in today's class, we are having something new and something different. Although it's still a basic part of the basic introduction to CSS before we get into doing a lot of, things with CSS. So in today's class, we'll be going into colors and backgrounds. So that's going to be what we'll be learning today. So I believe we learned something like this in one of the previous classes with HTML, but then we'll be looking at it today from the perspective of CSS. So here, CSS, like we all know, it's mainly used for styling. Since the HTML version it's deprecated. So for the first section of today's class, we will be dealing with CSS colors. And as you can see on the screen, there are 6 different types of color definition. The first is the named color. Second is the RGB color. We'd also look at the syntax and an example of how it would look like when we, use it to style an element. Next, we have the RGBA color. So I think this one is new to everybody because from the last time we treated colors under HTML, we only talked about the color name format, which is also the same as the name color in this content, the RGB format, and the hexadecimal value format. But here we'll be looking at the RGBA color, which is an extension of the RGB color format. So we'll also look at the syntax and an example under this method. Next, we have the Hsl color. So this one is very, very new. We didn't talk about this the last time we treated colors under HTML. So we'll be looking at the Hsl color, the syntax, and I would also show an example of how, it looks like. Also, we have the Hsla color, which is an extension of the Hsl color. So the two of them are basically the same, just that the Hsla has an added parameter where the A stands for the alpha. So we would know what the alpha in this particular color format represents when we get there. And lastly, we have the hexadecimal value color. So we treated this last week, so it's going to be the same thing here. But like I said before, in the last time we treated colors, I didn't go through how to convert the RGB to the hexadecimal format. So I'll be showing that in this class. So for those who don't know how to do that, you would know how to do it in this class today. So let's move on to the next section. Yeah, so the next section of today's class is CSS background. And as you can see, the CSS background has, different properties attached to it. So from the first item, you would see the background color. We'd look at the syntax and the example. Sorry. Next, we'd look at the background image with its syntax and also an example under that. Also, the background repeat, the background attachment, and the background position. So all these background properties are important under CSS background, but know that CSS background are not limited to these 5. These are like the major ones you need to know. So I think for these 5 there will be enough for you to style any kind of CSS background, except for some kind of technical stylings like that. So and lastly, we'll be seeing the CSS background shorthand. So the background shorthand is quite similar to the second section, but then it's a bit unique. It's like the combination of everything under the CSS background property. That's the 5 properties you can see in the content. So I'll be going through that too, and I'll show an example of how to use the background shorthand. So let's move. Yeah, so for the first session, we have CSS Colors. So one of the most important ways of making a web page look presentable and professional is by making use of colors. So as we all know, we've all visited a website or a web page at one point in time, and you would notice that there is almost no web page that doesn't have, a color attached to it. At least the header has, the footer, the navigation, there must be a color somewhere, is what catches the eye when you look at the website. And then we should also understand that appropriate and precise color definitions give a web page a standard look. So by this, we basically mean that, using colors, beautifies the web page, but also you can't just mix in different kind of colors into a web page. Everything has to look standard and normal, and that's what will actually make the user interface look better, more professional and more standard. You would hardly see a web page that, they just like a rainbow web page. You would hardly see anything like that, a web page with just different kind of colors. It's not possible. So knowing the appropriate ways of using this color and also the precise kind of colors you want to use is very, very important. And CSS allows you to, get this precise color that you might want to use to style your web page. So hence we would also look at the ways this can be achieved. Yeah, so as we all know, not all colors, we don't know all colors by name from what I know. And from another thing I know is that HTML supports about 140 named colors. But the funny story here is that the types of colors that exist due to the formats that we have, the RGB, the RGBA with the hex format, you can have as many colors as possible. It's not limited to 140 colors. So that way, some particular kind of colors do not even have an actual name, but then you can still get to use those kind of colors. So we'll be looking at the different formats that enable this to happen. So in CSS, there are 6 ways in which a user can define a color to be used for styling. So these ways that you can see on the screen are the 6 different ways of color definition. That's by the user. So any way that you see now is actually okay to use. It's just that some of the ways here actually give more precise color definition than others. So as you can see, the very first method we have here is the named color method, which is followed by the Rgb color, then the Rgba, then the Hsl color, which is followed by the Hsla and the Hex Value Color. So like I said, these 6 methods of color definition are actually good, but then some of them actually more precise than others. Because if you use the name color is only limited to the number of names that HTML accepts as colors. And like I said before, HTML only accepts 140 named colors. But with the rest of the formats, especially the RGB and RGBA, also with the hex value formats, you can actually get some colors that are not even named, like a lot of colors. We'll be looking into that too. So let's move on. Yeah, so for the first color method, we have the named colors. So this method makes use of the name of a specific color when styled. So as you can see, this method is the easiest method to go about styling with colors, as it uses just the name. So as an example, we have red, yellow, blue, brown. These colors have specific names that they are attached to. So using the names would actually, you basically mean you are using the color they depict. But like I said, this type of definition is limited because it doesn't let you get a precise kind of color you want. Not everybody who styles, web pages would want to use a red color. Probably someone out there might want to use a lighter red color or a darker red, but the named color only gives you a particular type of color which you can't alter or change. So that's why this method isn't very, common to use, especially with designers too. They don't really use the named color format. So next we have the RGB color. So this method makes use of the combination of red, green, and blue colors. Yeah, so I talked about this in one HTML class we had before about how the RGB color works. So each of these colors, that's the red, green, and blue, they all have integer values ranging from 0 to 255. So each of them on their own actually have values from 0 to 255, and 255 represents the highest, definition for that color in each of them. So using 255 for each of them will represent the highest colors, for that particular color. So if the red has a value of 255, it's going to give you a pure red color. Same with the green and same with the blue. But then if they all have 000, they would give you no color, no sign of red, no sign of green, no sign of blue. So that's how the RGB color appears. So yeah, the combination of each integer from the three colors is known as the RGB code. Yeah, so the when you get the integer values of the color you want to use, all all three values together is known as the RGB code, and it's with that code you can use to define a particular type of color you want. So a quick note: setting the integer value to 255 for each color would yield a white color. Yeah. So why is because if you'd actually set the red to the highest, the blue to the highest, and the green to the highest, and you merge, you know, all of them together, you'd actually get a white color at the end of the day. And I think this also applies practically, that if you in real life decide to do something like that, you probably get a white color mixing equal proportion of red, equal proportion of blue, and equal proportion of green. So you get a white color. And also, while setting the integer value to 0 for each color would yield a black color. Yes. So if your RGB code has 0 for red, 0 for blue, 0 for green, you would have a completely pure black color. So now you can see that having no integer value for each of these colors would give you a black color, and having the highest value for each of them would give you a white color. So that basically means that any other color you want to obtain or get is between the lowest values for all the colors and the highest values for all the colors. So any other color you are trying to obtain is between white and black. So the black is like the lowest point and the white is like the highest. So all other colors fall in between those two main colors, white and black. So that's how the RGB color works. So yes, on this screen we can see the syntax of how it is declared. So it starts with the RGB, then with some brackets which goes with red, green, and blue. And you can see from the example, it's also similar to the syntax we have. As from the example, we have the red to be assigned the integer value of 0. We also have the green to be assigned the integer value of 0. And the blue has its highest value, which is 255. So looking at the example, you would expect that if we should use this to style any element, that particular element is going to have a pure blue color without any sign of green or any sign of red. It's going to be blue, a pure blue type of color. So we'll be applying this to our styling when we get to the practical session of today's class. So let's move on. So next we have the Rgba color. So this particular method is an extension of the Rgb method. Yeah, so the Rgba color is quite similar with the previous color we saw, which is the Rgb color. The only difference is that this particular method possesses an alpha parameter added to the Rgb, which makes it Rgba, with the A meaning alpha. And this alpha is actually there for a reason. So the alpha in Rgb, that's in the Rgba, and it not being in the Rgb would actually give the two of them a difference eventually. So even if you were to use the same color codes in Rgb and Rgba, there will be a difference if when you set the alpha parameter. So as for the alpha parameter, it's used to determine the opacity of the color. So by the word opacity, we are talking about how transparent the color would look. So basically, after you set the color you want, that's with the Rgb, the A there determines how transparent it's going to look. If it's a color you could, see through or not. So the alpha, unlike the Rgba, is a decimal value and not an integer value. Yeah, so the alpha spans between zero point 0.0 and 1.0, with 0.0 depicting the highest the lowest transparency value. That means it's going to be like a mirror kind of color. It's a see-through color, then put it that way. And the 1.0 is almost meaning that it's not a color you can see through. So this alpha parameter lets you decide if how you want to present that color after you have defined the actual color, if it's something a user could see through or not. So I know in one project I've done before, I've used this particular Rgba color for a menu, and so it was a menu you could see through to the screen, but you would also see the menu appear on the nav bar. So we'll be looking into this Rgba eventually. Yeah, so here we have the syntax of the Rgba method, and it's quite similar with the Rgb method. But like I said, the only difference is the alpha parameter we have here, which is used to determine how transparent the color will be or to determine the opacity. So from the example here, we have the Rgba with the color code of 00255, which would also yield a blue color. But now, looking at the example, you would notice that there is a zero point 0.5 in the alpha section. So this particular kind of color and the Rgb color are not going to look the same, because this zero point 0.5 would actually make this color code look transparent to some level, probably a medium level, since zero point 0.5 falls almost in the middle of zero point 0.0 and 1.0. So the color you would have would be partially transparent and also not too transparent. So that's what this alpha here is for. And when I show you guys, that's when we get to the practical session, you would see that this particular color code and the previous one, they are quite similar, but at the same time they are also different because of this alpha. Yeah, so let's move on. Yeah, next we have the Hsl color. So this particular color is quite new to everybody because the last time we treated colors, we learnt about the hex, the RGB, and the named color. So this particular method is specified by a combination of hue, saturation, and lightness. So this particular color method is quite unique because you don't really get to, it doesn't use the RGB format. It uses the hue, saturation, and lightness generally, which is a concept that exists on its own generally, not really, a color. So the first parameter we have here is the hue, which is represented by H. So the hue is a degree on the color wheel, which ranges from 0 degree to 360 degree. So that's what the hue here depicts. So the unit for the hue here is in degrees, and also the hue is built in such a way that zero, that's 0 degree, which is the lowest degree, is depicted with red, 120 degree is green, and 240 degree is blue. So the red, that's like the pure red, the pure green, and the pure blue, they all have their degrees here. So all other kind of colors that can come in actually fall in the degrees that are in between the three that were stated as 0 degree, 120, and 240. So next we have the saturation, which is the second parameter in this method. So the saturation describes how intense a color should appear. So yeah, for those who are into web design, I believe this word is not anything new, or probably one or two people out there might already know what saturation is. So it just basically describes how intense the color should appear. If it's like it describes the quality, if it should come so solid or not very, very solid like that. So the saturation uses a percentage value which ranges from 0% to 100%. So I'm guessing 100% gives you the highest saturation for that color, and 0% gives you the lowest. So that's that for saturation. We'll be trying this out too when we get to the end of the slide. So next we have the lightness, which is the last parameter under the Hsl color type. So the lightness describes how light a color should appear. So the lightness here actually describes how light the color would be, if it's going to be something that will be very bright or not. Now I know some of these explanations, they are looking too technical, lightness here, intensity here, but don't worry, when we get to the VS Code you would see how this color code works for the HSL method. So the lightness also is a percentage value which ranges from 0% to 100% also. Yeah, so on this slide you can see the syntax for the HSL method. So the HSL starts with the HS and L. Then within the bracket you have the hue, saturation, and lightness. So as we all know, the hue is actually in degrees, which you don't really need to define mathematically. I think by just putting an integer there, the CSS would be able to translate that as degrees. And also the saturation and the lightness are in percentages. So as you can see in the example, we have the hue to be 0 with a saturation of 50% and lightness of 72%. So I really don't know what this color yields, but trust me, after the class would know what this color would yield. Next, we have the Hsla color. Now, this particular method is an extension of the HSL method. So from the HSLA, you can assume that the A here stands for alpha also, like in the Rgba color. And as we learned before, the alpha is actually used to describe the opacity of the color. By that we mean how transparent the color would be if it's going to be, you know, a completely see-through color. So the alpha parameter is used to determine the opacity of the color, and it's also a decimal value. So we already know this. It's a decimal value, ranges from zero point 0.0 to 1.0. Yeah, so on this screen we have the syntax for the HSLA, which is similar to the HSL, but then the alpha is the last parameter here. And from the example you can see that it's similar to the example we had in the HSL section. The only difference is the fact that we have an alpha parameter of zero point 0.3. So I think zero point 0.3 here is, it's quite a transparent color, what you would call transparent. Probably not as transparent as zero point 0.1 or 2 or zero point 0.2, but zero point 0.3 is transparent enough. It's going to be a see-through color that you would see properly. So we'll be seeing this later on. Yes, and lastly we have the hexadecimal value color. So this method makes use of a hexadecimal representation of colors. The hex value is made up of a 6-symbol code. So we talked about this before in one of the HTML classes where we treated colors. But for the sake of those that are new here, I would go over this properly. So the hex value color is a color made up of 6 symbols, which could either be numbers or alphabets. So these 6 symbols can actually be broken down into 3 single groups. By that we mean a group would contain 2 symbols. So you would have the first 2 symbols to depict a group, the second 2 for a group, and the last 2 for a group. So that's 3 group of colors, but at the end of the day put together they all have 6 symbols. So this code can be gotten from a conversion of RGB values to hexadecimal values. Yes, so I know in the last time we treated colors, I didn't really go into the conversion of RGB colors to hexadecimal colors, but when we get to the practical session, I would show how to do that, so you would know how to get the hexadecimal format of for a particular RGB color. Yeah, so we have the syntax for the hex value color, and as you can see, it starts with a hashtag. Now, followed by the hashtag are the first 2 symbols, which represent the red color RR. The next 2 symbols, GG, represents the green, and the BB represents the blue. So this particular syntax you are seeing is not a color code just because the alphabets. No, I'm only using the RR to represent that, the first 2 symbols are for red, the second 2 are for green, so the last 2 are for blue. And as you can see in the example, we have the hashtag FFCC5E. So the F actually represents the red color, the CC represents the green, and the 5E represents the blue. Now, for those who don't really know about hexadecimals, the EF that you see in the example actually represents hexadecimal digits. So I'll be going over this later on. So I would explain how the E is gotten, how the F is gotten, and why we have E and F and not the actual numbers they represent. So in the next section, we have the CSS background. So we treated background in a previous HTML class, but here we'll be looking into the background property for CSS. Yeah. So the CSS background properties are used to define how the background of elements should appear. So the background property here is not limited to the one of HTML, which only lets you um, apply a color to elements. Here you can have multiple properties you can use to define the background of different elements, and we'll be seeing that in the next slide. So there are lots of background properties provided by CSS, and these properties include the following. So as you can see, the very first property we have here is the background color, which is followed by the background image, then the background repeat, followed by the background attachments, and lastly the background position. Now, because CSS is, you know, very dynamic and is used majorly for styling, the background properties are actually more than these five properties you can see. But these five are probably the main properties that you would need for any kind of, styling you are doing that involves background, except you want to do some form of technical styling. Then there are some specific, types of properties you would use for that. But majorly, these are like the basic ones to know. And trust me, once you know these ones, you can go ahead styling any background you want with these five. So the first property we have is the background color property. So the background color is used to specify the background color of the element. So this is actually the easiest property to understand. This property is similar with the BG color property in HTML that we learned in a previous class. So they basically do the same thing here. They are used to specify the background color of the element. Yeah, so we have the syntax of the background color, which starts with background followed by a dash, then color, and then you have to assign it a color value. Now, the reason why I didn't have a particular color here was because I wanted you to know that the background color syntax can actually be assigned any type of color value. And by color value, we mean it could be a named color, a RGB color, a RGBA color, a Hsl color, a Hsla color, and a hex value color. So any of those six color types can actually be attached to the background color in the syntax. That's why I didn't put a particular color here. And so if you look at the example that we have here, you can see that for this example, I use the hexadecimal value color. So the background color is assigned hashtag B0D4DE. So this particular color type here is the hexadecimal value color type. Next, we have the background image. So the background image property enables a user to define the background of an element with an image. Yes, so it is possible for you to have an image that would be the background of a particular element. And unlike HTML, which has this particular attribute to be limited to just the table and the body, for this particular property in CSS, it's actually not limited to just table and the body. It affects all elements, including paragraph, headings, tag, links, any kind of element. You can have the background of that particular element to be an image. So you can see that CSS gives you more dynamics. It gives you more power to style different HTML elements however you want it. So let's see the syntax. Yeah, so for the syntax of the background image, it's assigned a URL. So this URL value actually specifies the location of the image you want to use. And as you can see, it has the bracket and double quotes which would hold the image name inside. That's the image name and the extension of the image together. So as you can see from the example, the background image is assigned the URL of cat.png. So the .png here is the extension name, and the cat here is the name of the photo. So I noticed that in the last time we treated anything related with images, people had issues, displaying the photos, showing the pictures, and all of that. So for the sake of this class, anytime you want to use this particular background image property, it's always better you have the image and the HTML file in the same location in the folder. And you should also cross check the image extension name. Now, I know the image extension names are probably ranking between .png, .jpg, .svg, which is okay. Some people might know that, but that's quite a different extension name, and .jpeg. Now, the .jpg and the .jpeg are not the same types of extension. So you probably want to look at the extension name properly before trying to use, this particular syntax to get the background image of any element. So this shouldn't be much of an issue when we get to the actual coding. Next, we have the background repeat property. So the background repeat property affects the background image property. So now we are entering into the part where by some properties affect other properties. So what this basically means is that if there is no background image at first, this particular property, even when enabled, would not work. So the background repeat property needs the background image property to exist first. So there has to be an image out there. Then this particular property can, make changes to that image. So by default, the background image repeats if the image is smaller than the entire content within the page. So we'll be showing how this is possible. And you would notice that if we decide to use a very small image as the background of, our HTML documents, if it's smaller than the screen, the image would have to duplicate itself in a horizontal format, or sometimes horizontally and vertically, and you would see multiple pictures of that image on the background. And using that kind of image as a background isn't very very good, especially in today's websites that we have. I don't think any website has a background that is repeated like that, except if it's a theme background. But then having repeated images on the background, it won't look very nice. So don't worry, we'll see the practical aspect of this and you would see what I mean. So in view of this, that's the fact that the background image repeats. The background repeat property describes how the image should repeat vertically or horizontally, or it also has a value of none. So you can also choose not to repeat the image. So that would basically mean that whichever way the image was able to appear on the screen is how you're going to have it on the background. You're not going to have the image, duplicating itself just to fit in the entire content of the page. So in the example we have below, you can see that the background repeat is assigned the value repeat dash x. So repeat dash x here actually means the x in this value represents the x-axis. you know X-axis and y-axis is something we must have heard about in mathematics, graph, and all that stuff we did. So the x-axis goes vertically, or is it? Oh, sorry, it goes horizontally. Yeah, the x-axis goes horizontally. That's from left to right. While the y-axis goes vertically. That's from top to bottom. So with this particular property, if you'd eventually choose for the image to repeat, you can also declare how you want it to repeat. So if you want the image repeating from left to right of the screen, you would need to use the repeat dash x, which means it would repeat on the x axis horizontally. Also, if you don't want it that way and you want it to repeat from top to bottom, that's vertically on the screen, the value that would be assigned to this property would be repeat dash y. So we'll be looking into this later on. So next we have the background attachment property. So this background attachment property also affects the background image. So now we've seen two properties that would need the image property to exist. So without the image property, this particular one, even when enabled, would not be able to do anything. So this attachment property specifies if the image is fixed or scrolled with the rest of the page rendered on the browser. So what we mean is this. Now, most web pages you've seen before, they have the scroll bar which lets you access all the contents of the web page. But when you scroll down, other content you've missed would actually go higher in the screen, and you wouldn't see them anymore because the screen is actually limited to what it can show you. And because the web page was built in such a way that it's more than the screen, you can't get to see the entire web page at once. But now, with the attachment property, you can actually determine if you want the image to be fixed or to be scrolled with the other content. So this basically means this: if the attachment properties are assigned the value of fixed, you are going to have an image that will be fixed on your web page. But even when you scroll through the entire web page, that's when you scroll through the contents of the page, the image is going to stay stagnant. It's not going to move. So it's something you would be able to see even when you have scrolled up, that's to the highest point, and you have scrolled down. The image will just be there. Other contents will keep moving, but the image would actually just stay there like that. Yeah. So we'll be seeing that also. Don't worry about it. Don't stress yourself. When we get there, we'll see an example of that. And I also noticed that for most recent types of websites that are being built, they mostly have the menu to be like that. You would have probably noticed it in a website you visit, one time like that. You would have just noticed that the menu bar, even while scrolling, is just stagnant there. It's just staying on the screen. Even when you scroll down to the footer, it's still there. Yeah, so although that might not have been done with this particular property, but this property also does the same thing that enabled that to happen. Yeah, so this one is here is for just images. The property that made that one happen, in that kind of website is quite different. So we'll probably see that in future classes. So yeah, here we have an example of how the attachment syntax looks like. So you have the background dash attachment, and we can see that the value we assigned here is the fixed value. So by assigning the background this particular value, it would mean that that particular content is not going to move. irrespective of how huge the web page is, how much we scroll, it will just stay stagnant there. And yeah, I know some people out there might be thinking it's not possible, but yes, it's very, very possible for that to happen. So we'll be seeing that very soon. So lastly, we have the background position. So the background position is used to alter the initial position of the image on the screen. Yeah, so if you notice very well from a previous class we've had where we talked about images, you would notice that by default the image is placed on the left of top left of the web page, depending on the elements that come before that image. Irrespective of how you put the image, it's always going to be on the left hand side of the screen, and sometimes very, very close to the margin. So this particular property actually allows us to position you know the image the way we want it. So you might decide to have it on the right side, you might decide to have it in the middle, or however you want it. It lets you alter the position of the image. Yeah, so here's an example of the background position syntax, and you can see it's assigned the value of right. So with this value, when the image is actually initialized on the screen, it's not going to appear on the left hand side of the screen, but it would appear at the other end, which is the right side of the screen. Okay, so lastly, we'll be looking at CSS Background Shorthand. Now, this shorthand is quite important because it actually makes the job of this background properties very, very easy. And the reason for this background shorthand is because rather than having to declare the background image with its own separate, syntax, background attachment, background color, all these properties can actually be defined in one property. So we'll be seeing this background shorthand in more details. So it is possible to list all the background properties in one property. Yes, so this is true. So the background image, background color, background attachment, background position, we can actually see all of this within one property rather than declaring them, as individual properties. We can have all of them within just one property. And this property is known as the background shorthand property. So this is like a quick way of accessing those background properties we saw before. You know, just a quicker way of using those properties rather than styling them individually on their own. You get a property that can harbor everything within itself. And also using this property shortens the syntax. Yeah. So like I said before, instead of declaring each of those properties individually, it's not actually bad. It's okay if you want it that way. But here you have a quicker and a faster way to do it. And this one can actually hold each of those properties together. And by doing that, it saves time. So probably you would say this particular property is faster than using those other properties. Yeah. But then this particular property has the way it is structured, which makes it quite different from the rest of them. So we'll be seeing that also. So the shorthand property works in a particular order of properties, which can be seen below. Yeah, so like I said before, the background shorthand property has a particular structure it works with, and this structure has a particular order it follows. So the order of this structure cannot be scattered. It has to follow the same order. And as you can see, the very first property in this order is the background color. which is followed by the background image, followed by the background repeat, then the attachment property, and lastly the position property. So if you are going to be making use of this property, it would mean that you would have to arrange each of the other properties in this order. It cannot be scattered, it cannot be done anyhow. It has to follow this particular order. Now you might be wondering, what if you don't need a particular property here? If you don't need a particular property in this order, probably let's say you don't need the attachment property. If you don't need it, no problem. All you just need to do is to make sure the first property is the color, which is followed by the image, then the repeat, and lastly the position. So if there are cases whereby a property here is not needed, it's not an issue. Just follow the particular order and CSS would, make the changes you want the way you want it. So that's how the background shorthand works. Yes, so and here we can see an example of the shorthand property, which actually starts with the color, as you can see. So the color we have here is a hexadecimal value color, which is hashtag FF00FF. So like I said before, the color comes first in this order, which is followed by the image, which is in the URL format with the name of the image and the extension name inside. Next, we have the repeat property. So for the repeat property, you can see that it's assigned the value no repeat. So this would mean that the image isn't going to repeat at all, like we all know. Next, we have the attachment property here, which is fixed. So using this property, the image is going to stay stagnant wherever it is on the screen without moving. And lastly, we have the center property, which is for the position. So, using this, it means that you're going to have your image in the middle of the screen. So, without taking our time, let's go into our VS Code and see how all this happens. Okay, so these are our CSS folder. We're going to create a new file for this class. So we'll have this to be a new HTML file. Call this index. Okay, we already have index there. Have this to be main.html. So we'll start with the doc type, HTML, the head. For those who know how to use the boilerplate, you can as well use that too. There's nothing wrong in that. Just choose to do mine this way. Also the body. In the head, we have the meta and the title tags. So we'll call the title CSS Colors and Backgrounds. Yeah, so I think that's that for that. Now, from yesterday's class, we learned about the three methods of styling. So we'll be making use of probably all the methods in this class. So let's start by defining the elements we want. So we'll have the heading one. We'll have different headings. So for this, we'll have CSS Colors. HTML. Mm, yeah. So now we'll be using the Xml Css. So we'll create another CSS file inside our folder. We'll call this main2.css. So, and next thing we'll do is to link this CSS to our HTML, which from yesterday's class we learned that we can do that with the link element. So we have the rel equals to style sheet. The href would be main2.css, and the type is text slash css. So without wasting time, let's quickly go into the colors. So we are going to have a color for the heading 1 tag, that's the CSS color. And so we'll be looking through the different color methods that we learned in today's class. So for the first one, we'll have the h1 here, which is the way to declare, using the selector. We are using the element selector here, which works with the tag name. So we'll have the curly braces and then the property you want to change. So we're going to change the color of the font, that's the text itself. So the color, using the name color, we can have it to be blue. Like I said, HTML supports 140 color values. So you can see that for the B color, you have beige, bisque, black, blatched, almond, blue, blue violet, brown, and Bollywood. So you have a lot of colors, but the name color is actually limited to just 140. So let's use the Bollywood color. If we save this and open with our live server, okay, so this actually affects all the colors. Okay, yes, that's because they are all heading 1 tags. So you can see that using the element selector, it affects all other elements that have the same tag name with this. So that's why you actually have the color of that heading 1 that we use to affect the rest of the headings, because they are all heading 1 you know element. So in order to style just that particular heading 1, we are going to need a class name or an ID name. So we'll assign this an ID name for this head 1. So we'll remove this heading 1 and we'll have dot head 1. Yeah, so if we save this, you would notice now that it only affects. Okay, we've not saved it here. Oh yeah, the head 1 being an ID actually starts with a hashtag and not full stop. Yeah, so that was the mistake. So we'd have the hashtag, we'll save, and you would see that it only affects the first heading. So this is how the color property works, and here we use the named color. So let's try the RGB color and see what it yields. You can see that even while typing it, the RGB and the RGBA pops out to show you that these color types are actually supported by HTML and also by the editor we are using, which is VS Code. So for the red, we would have 50, green have 70, and the blue is probably have 100. Save. Yeah, so we have a different color. Now, comparing this color among red, green, and blue, it's possible to say that this particular color is could be the most closest to blue because we actually have our blue color in VS Code with the highest value, which is 100. So if we actually reduce this to something as low as 30, would have a different color entirely. And the closest color to this would be green because green has the highest value being 70 in the middle. So if we save this and go back to our browser, yeah, so you would see that the color now changes and the closest color to this is probably the green color. Let me zoom this a bit for you to see it. Yeah, okay, so I think this is better. Yeah, so let's look at the next color code, which is the RGBA. The RGBA A will actually stand for alpha. We'll have this to be 50, say 70, and 100. So for the alpha value, we are going to have this to be the highest, which is 1.0. So we'll see what that gives us. Save. Okay, so it gives us a blue color. So let's take it from 1.0 to 0.0. Go back. Now you can see that the color doesn't appear anymore. Yes, so that's because the zero point 0.0 value actually makes the color very, very transparent, even to the point that you can't see the color anymore. So this color actually still exists on this web page. In case you don't know, the color is still here. And if we should, view the source code for this, you would see that the color, the element that holds this property is here. Only that we can't see it because the zero point 0.0 decimal value for the alpha attribute makes it too transparent to the point that we can't see the color anymore. So let's use something not very not very far, probably zero point 0.4 or 3 would do. Yeah, zero point 0.4 should do. So if we go back, okay, yeah, so now you can see that the color is quite transparent. Probably you might not really notice this because it's directly on you know the body, that's the background of this document. But then when you create like a nav bar or a particular section that has a background within it, you'd be able to see that this color would show through the background. That means you would almost be able to see the background color through this color. You know what, let's even try that. So I would add a background color here, say brown, something thick. We'll save this. Yeah, so looking at this now, you can see that the color is not very visible, and that's because the background color is very, very thick. So using the opacity actually makes the color very transparent. Yeah, so which other one have we not tried? Okay, let's try the HSL. Move this. The HSL. So for the hue, we are going to have it to be 90 degree. Saturation would be let's say 50%. Lightness would be equally 50%. Yeah, so for this we have a light green color. So let's see what happens if we increase the percentage of each of them to 100. So we'll go with this the saturation first. Yeah, so now you can see that it's also light green, but it's actually quite intense than the former color. We probably would not notice this because you know I didn't like save a picture of the former one. So you know what, let me apply it on two elements so you'd see the difference. So we'll have an ID for the next heading one to be head two. We'll copy this. So now this to be 50. We'll have this to be 100. Okay. Oh yeah, this is meant to be heading two. Yes, so you can see what this saturation parameter has done to each of these colors. So the color codes for them are quite similar, but the first one has a saturation of 50% and the second has a saturation of 100%. So you can see that the second color is a lot lighter than the first color. So that's what the saturation here actually does. It actually shows you the intensity of how the color would look. So let's apply this also to the lightness. So we'd have both to be 50 and here we'd have the lightness to be 100. So if we save this and go back to our browser, okay, so the color is probably too light. Let's go down a little bit to 70%. Yeah. Yeah, so you can see that there's a difference between the first color and the second color. So the lightness here actually shows how light the color would look. So if you notice well, the HTML text has a lighter color than the CSS colors, despite the fact that they have the same hue value and the same saturation value, but the lightness value is quite different, 50% to 70%, just 20% difference, and you can see how much that difference is in the two colors. So that's how the Hsl color works. So without wasting time, let's just quickly go into the alpha parameter. That's for the HSLA. This will be 0.5. Make these two colors the same, and for this would have an alpha value of 0.2. Okay. 7. Okay, yeah, so the alpha value here still does the same thing it does in the RGBA type, and you can see that the HTML text has a more transparent color than the CSS colors above it. So I hope we all understood how the alpha value works. Probably because we applied this to text, it might not really show its property. But then when we apply this to a particular kind of nav bar or a section, you would notice the transparency in the color, when we get into that. So lastly, we have the hexadecimal value, which begins with a hashtag and then continues with 6 symbols. Now, two of those symbols representing red, green, and blue. So for the red, we would have the highest hexadecimal value, which is FF. For the green, we could have E5. And for the blue, let's still have FF. So this should give you, wow, it gives us a light pink color. So I said before that I would show you a way you could get the hexadecimal value from the RGB format. So now the RGB format actually spans from 0 to 255 for each color. That's the red, green, and blue. So basically, this is how it works. The hexadecimal value actually represents base 16. That's in the number system. And base 16 is actually values from 0 to 15. So that would actually mean that you have base 16 values to be 0, 1, 2, 3. Let me just give a space. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now the next value you are supposed to have is 10. But because in hexadecimal you do not represent 10 as 10, because the hexadecimal is actually an extension of the decimal system, and the decimal system actually spans from 0 to 9. So 9 being the last digit, any number that comes after it would be represented with an alphabet. So the hexadecimal, like I said, is 0 to 15. But now from 10 to 15 is in hexadecimal and not in decimal. But because the hexadecimal system uses the decimal system, because it's an extension from the decimal system, it cannot have 10, 11, 12, 13, following it. So what they did was that the value of 10 is represented by the first letter in the alphabet, which is A. Then next we have 11, which is also represented by B. Next we have 12, which is C. 13, D. 14, E. And 15, F. So like I said before, the hexadecimal value format is actually a base 16 value format. And the base 16 actually represents digits within 0 to 15. Now, instead of having it to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now from 10 to 15, it can't have those actual values because, like I said before, the hexadecimal was an extension from the decimal. And in the decimal system, which is base 10, you have numbers spanning from 0 to 9. So the moment you get to 10, they are represented with symbols, which are, the what's it called? The letters in the alphabet. That's from A. So you have 10 to be A, 14, 11 B, 12 C, 13 D, 14 E, and 15 F. So now looking at this color code we have here, we have this to be hashtag FFE5FF. So the FF here actually represents 1515, 14 5 15 15. So this color code, if you should translate it to the original way they would actually mean on a number line, the first two symbols would be 15 15. Then the E5 would be 14 and 5, and the last two symbols would also be 15 15. So to get the RGB color from this, all what you just simply need to do is to multiply this by the base of 16, and you would get the actual RGB color for this one. So to do that, we would basically just say 15 times 16. Okay, that would give us 240. Okay, you know what? Let's actually go from the RGB to the hexadecimal value for this to be very understandable. So let's imagine we have an RGB of let's say 124, 220, and the blue is also 220. So this is a RGB value. Let's remove this, or let's just comment this. If we save this, you'd actually have this value here, which is slightly between green and blue. So to get the hexadecimal value for this, you're going to divide each of these values by 16. So dividing the 124 by 16, you would actually get the value 7 with a remainder. So for the hexadecimal value of this, the first value you would have would be 7. So next you use the remainder to divide the base of 16. So 7 times 16 will give you 112, and the remainder would be 12 itself. So 16 in 12, 16 can't go in 12, so that would be 0 remainder 12. Now, like I said before, the 12 on this hexadecimal number line is actually represented by C, because A is 10, B is 11, and C is 12. So the 124 in hexadecimal value would be renamed as 7C. 7C. So you'd also apply that to this value and to this other value. So let's quickly do that. Divide 220 by 16. You would get the value of 13. So from here, we would know that 13 is D. That's the D here. And whatever is the remainder, you would also divide, by 16 again. So this also has a remainder of 12. So that means the hexadecimal value for 220 is actually DC. And since it is also the same for the blue color, you would have this to be 7C, DC, then DC. So let's see if it gives us the same color. So we'll remove this, and we'll have this color to be hashtag 7C, DC, 7C, DC, DC. If we save this, we are supposed to get exactly that same color we had using the RGB format. So going back to our browser, we have the same color. So that's how you convert the RGB to the hexadecimal value. And to convert the hexadecimal value back to the RGB value, you would multiply those colors by the base of 16. So that's how it's done. So that's how the RGB and the hex value formats are connected to each other. So it's a very, very easy math to do for those that might want to use the hexadecimal value of a particular RGB value. So I think we've really dwelt on colors here. Let's quickly go into background without wasting time. Remove all this. So heading one. So quickly, background color. We can use the named hex value HSL RGBA any type you want. So this will actually give a background color to the element with heading one. We save this and go back to our browser. Yeah, we have this to be the background color of this text. So without wasting time, let's quickly look at background image. This is done with the URL. Okay, let's see. We have an image here. Okay, we'll be using this. Copy. So the image here is cat.jpg. If we save this, you would notice that the image for the particular element will be a cat. Yeah. So we have this to be the image, but because of how large the image is, the entire image cannot really crop crop up to fit this particular way it is built for this element. So we'll probably be using this, most times, you know, as a picture, as a background image of a particular section of your web page and not for text. Okay. What other thing? Yeah, the background position. PX. Okay, it doesn't apply here. Let's try to declare this image on its own using the image attributes. It's also be cat.jpg. So we'll probably use the inline styling here. So background image repeat would be it 100 pixels with pixels. Going back to our browser, we have the image looking this way. Okay. Okay, so I think this property works with the body. So let's try styling our body. Background image would be URL. cat.jpg. So if we save this, I'll go back to a web page. Yeah, and so now you can see the background is actually using this image, and okay, the image is really large, so this image cannot repeat. So let's use a smaller image for this. Save this, come back here. So this image is actually repeating, but we can't see it because the content we have isn't a lot. So let's add more content to our HTML page. So if I save this and go back to our browser, you can see that the image keeps repeating. Okay, let's remove the other styling we have. Let's comment this, save. Now if we go back, you would see that the image for this background keeps repeating as we keep scrolling down. It keeps repeating like that. So this is the default way a background image works. So if the image is actually smaller than the entire web page, which spans from up to down, the image would only duplicate itself on that web page. So let's remove this image. We don't need this. So now we would apply the background repeat. Background repeat would be repeat dash x, which is supposed to repeat horizontally. So if we save this and go back, okay, yeah, so now you can see that it doesn't repeat vertically on the screen, it repeats horizontally. And the reason why you can't see this is because the content of our web page doesn't go outside the screen. So peradventure we had content that actually moved outside the screen horizontally, you're going to have another scroll bar down here. That's somewhere around here. You would have the scroll bar to be somewhere at this part of the screen. And when you scroll, from left to right, you would notice that this image actually duplicates, horizontally, that from the left to the right hand side of the screen. But if we should change this to repeat dash y, which is vertical, it's going to retain its default form. So if we do that and we save, it should have the default way it was. Yeah, so you can see it repeats vertically on the screen. So that actually means that by default the background repeat is set on repeat dash y. That's if the image is smaller than the web page. That's how it is on by default. But except that you can actually choose to repeat it horizontally rather than vertically. Okay, say background position, we change this to the fix isn't okay. Yeah, let's say the right. If we save, yeah, so it still repeats, but the background now, okay, this background is quite big, at least for the screen we are seeing. But if it wasn't so big, the image being on the left before would actually move to the right hand side. So we might not be able to see this now, but just know that that's how it works. And also,
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. Why don't
okay,
you help us reduce the size? Let's see how it works, sir.
okay, me, I should use the size of the image.
Yes, help us use the image size and let's see what
Okay,
you try to explain to us how it works.
okay, so hopefully, I hope this image doesn't, no, let me remove the repeat y. That's the background repeat. Okay, so I think for this, I can't reduce the image of this because we are not using the image, attribute to declare this. But then let me see if there are other properties I can use. Okay, so this actually reduced the size of the image, but then it's actually still duplicated the image to fill up the whole screen. Say background repeat, none, no repeat. Okay, so as you can see, the image is on the right side of the screen and it's no more on the left. So I'll need to zoom. Okay, I'll need to increase this for you to see it. Okay, you know what? Let me reduce this. Let's let's remove this background size. So if I save this now, you should see the image now on the right side of the screen. Oh, it still spans through the whole screen. Oh, okay. Let's say let's have it to be 300 pixels. Yes, so this is exactly what I mean. So you can see now that the image is on the right side of the screen and not on the left. So the background position actually gives you the power to change the position of the image. So by default, it would have been on the left, but now it's on the right. Now, the reason why this property might not work could be because of how large your image is. So if it's really large, even when you declare this property, it would cover the entire screen you are seeing. So you'll probably be using this property on a small image, probably a smaller type of picture. So that's how this background position property was. So let's try to push this to the center. Save. Yes, so you can see now we have the image at the center. That's the middle of the screen. So the last property will be touching is the background attachment. So let's quickly do that. The attachment property, now we would set this to fixed because by default it's unscrolled. So that basically means that if you use the scroll bar, the picture or the image would actually go with the other contents and leave the page. But we'll set this to fixed. And now when we save this, if we go back to our web browser and we decide to scroll, the image isn't expected to leave the screen. So you can see that other contents are moving, but the image is static. You can see that the image it's not even moving a tiny bit. It's just there, almost you know, like it's part of the, background, which is it's now part of, the image now is part of the background. So the fixed value, attaches it permanently to the background. So it's not going to, move with the other content of this, web page. So you can see other contents are moving, the image is not. So that's how the attachment property works. And like I said before, the properties for the background are not limited to these five. There are a lot. As you can see, we just learnt a new one, which is the background size, which I didn't even, talk about. And this property lets you reduce and increase the size of the image to the way you want it. So I think we all must have gained something here. So time for questions.